Hello and welcome to Understanding Adventist Beliefs. If you want to know more about Seventh-day Adventists and what they believe, this is for you. I have invited theological experts to join us for a frank discussion about Adventist faith and practice. We will explore the biblical reasons why Adventists believe what they confess in their fundamental beliefs. And we invite you to reflect with us in greater depth the biblical meaning, beauty, and relevance of Adventist beliefs. My name is Frank Hasel. I'm your host, and today we will look more closely at fundamental belief number 21, stewardship. Today I have the pleasure of having Dr. Rahel Wells and Keldie Paroschi as my conversation partners. Dr. Wells is from the United States and is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Andrews University. She holds a PhD in Old Testament Studies from Wheaton College, and her current research focuses on God's care for animals and the earth and various themes in the Old Testament, with special interest in the Old Testament books of Deuteronomy and Habakkuk. Keldie Paroschi is originally from Brazil, but has lived many years in Central Europe and currently is a PhD student in New Testament Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. I was born and raised in Germany and currently work as an Associate Director of the Biblical Research Institute at the world headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Silver Spring, Maryland. Rahel and Keldie, thank you for joining me in this conversation about the biblical teaching of stewardship and what it means for Seventh-day Adventists. Before we enter into a discussion, however, I think it will be helpful to read the actual words of that fundamental belief number 21 so that we have a better understanding of what we are talking about. Here I quote, "We are God's stewards, entrusted by Him with time and opportunities, abilities and possessions, and the blessings of the earth and its resources. We are responsible to Him for their proper use. We acknowledge God's ownership by faithful service to Him and our fellow human beings, and by returning tithe and giving offerings for the proclamation of His gospel and the support and growth of His church. Stewardship is a privilege given to us by God for nurture in love and the victory over selfishness and covetousness. Stewards rejoice in the blessings that come to others as a result of their faithfulness." That's the wording of that particular fundamental belief on stewardship. And it covers a lot of different subjects and aspects, covers a lot of ground. But I would like to start our conversation by just raising this question. Why, when we are talking about stewardship, why is stewardship so important for God, for us? Any ideas that could help us understand that a little better?
Yeah, I'll jump in there first.
Sure.
I think this is such an important topic, and as we just read, I mean, there's just so many elements that it's touched on here. But really, the Bible portrays like everything that we own, everything in this earth, everything that we see ultimately belongs to God. So I think stewardship, would be the first point to me. Stewardship points me to who is the real owner of this world and the real owner of everything that I own, everything that I interact with. And that keeps me grounded where I need to be. And then it's also really our responsibility that God gave us even before sin, which was to care for what He had made. Mm-hmm. And so it's this both and. God owns, and yet He partners with us in that responsibility of caring for and looking after everything that He's made on this earth. So it's this dual role that stewardship kind of ties both God and us together, I think, in some ways that many other beliefs do not.
I think that's a really nice way to think about God, right? That he wants to delegate, he wants to share, he wants us to not only enjoy the benefits of his creation and of his world, but he wants us to take a part in taking care of it. And I think that says a lot about God. He's not a God that's keeping everything for himself. He's really interested not only in sharing, but in having us involved, having us care. And that's meaningful because it says something about us and how we are important. We're important in helping. We're important in serving and working alongside with God.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. So you would say it teaches us an important thing about God, who God is, that he is a God who is not just involved in himself,
Right.
but he is a God who wants to share, who delights if we participate in the things that he has granted us to participate in, and that it also teaches us something about us, that we are responsible for the things that he has entrusted to us, and that actually he is the ultimate owner, as you have mentioned first, Rahel. Any additional thoughts that you would like to share?
Yeah, I would just say that maybe like after sin, it has a new level of meaning for us. Stewardship does, in that the motivation for it becomes God's redemption for us, right? So we have this added motivation of like incredible levels of gratitude for what God has done for us. We shouldn't even be alive, right? So the fact that we have life, that we have blessings, this just, multiple times through the Bible, God indicates that this is one of the reasons we can give with rejoicing. So it reminds us not only of our creation, but also of our redemption. I think that stewardship kind of pulls these two together as well.
That's a good point, and it really shows how these blessings that God gives us is not just for ourselves, but in serving and taking care of these things, we're also sharing these blessings with other people and sharing that redemption with others as well, extending those blessings to others, which helps them understand a little bit more about who is this God who gives us so much. So that's a really good point about the redemption. Yeah.
So let's explore that a little more, what you have just touched upon, both of you. What would you say is the specific blessing that we gain from being faithful stewards that God has called us to be?
There's so many. But I think one of the things we were just talking about, right, is it keeps us focused, keeps where our focus should be, not on like gaining things, right? Prosperity or money, but our focus is on giving, our focus is on sacrifice, our focus is on furthering God's work in his kingdom. And so it helps us to stay focused on what really matters. I think that's a big one for me, at least as I think about the blessings of stewardship in my own life.
Any additional thoughts why stewardship is so significant and important for us?
Yeah, I think, like it says, it keeps us grounded, but also it helps us develop a sense of gratitude, a sense of worship to God, who really has given us everything that we need. He doesn't leave us by ourselves. He doesn't, he's the giver and the sustainer of life, and not only of life, but of all of the blessings, everything that comes along with it. And, we have so much to be thankful for. We don't have anything in and of ourselves. It's really, everything goes back to God. And it really keeps that first and foremost, I think, in our lives when we have that understanding.
In that sense, really, stewardship teaches us, it's an exercise in humility, in a sense, because it shows that it is not me who is at the center of gravity, so to speak, at the center of the attention of everything. We are dependent on someone outside of ourselves. We're dependent on God. As you said, actually, ultimately, God is the owner of everything, and we just are here for a limited period of time. But he has given us the strength to build. He has given us the skills to earn money. He has given us the ability to be a blessing to others and to care for his creation. but ultimately it doesn't belong to us. We come into this world with nothing. And we go out of this world at the end with nothing in our pockets, really. So everything is given to us for a limited period of time, and God actually owns it.
And when we understand that everything is given to us, we don't really have anything for ourselves, that should change how we look at those who are less fortunate, for example. Instead of looking down on them or saying, oh, this person didn't work hard enough or whatever, it's that sense that I don't have anything for myself. Here's somebody less fortunate than I am. Maybe there's something I can do to help to share the blessings that I have with somebody else, which really are blessings that come from God in the first place.
So it can be
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yes, Rahel.
No, I was just going to say that I think that is actually tied all through the Old Testament when it talks about stewardship, giving back. It ties in both, like, for instance, if we look at Leviticus 25, it's talking about the sabbatical year, which is where they were to, every 7th year, let the land lie and have rest, but not just to give the land rest, but for all of that produce to help the poor and to help those who were in need, as well as to help the animals. So it's this multifaceted. They were not just giving of their, not just caring in general, but they were very specifically to give of their means, not just on the sabbatical year, but actually tithing. Part of their tithe was to go towards those who were in need. So it's this really comprehensive picture of caring, and they were to do this with rejoicing, because, like we were mentioning, like you were mentioning, Keldie, they're saved, right?
Yeah.
God saved them, so great. All the more reason to give, because they're just full of joy at what God has done for them.
This is fascinating. So as I was listening to you, Keldie, what you said, it reminded me, actually then, stewardship, rightly, correctly understood, is an exercise where I can grow in compassion to other people. And seen from that perspective, really, if you think about it, stewardship and everything that belongs to it, tithe, sharing my offerings, the resources that God has given me, is really a unique and fascinating opportunity to become more like Jesus, become more like God, because He is a most generous God. He is a God who freely gives and generously gives and doesn't hold back. And so in giving us that opportunity, we have a unique opportunity, I think, to grow, become more like Him, if we exercise that and use that opportunity.
Well, and it's interesting, the fundamental belief mentions time, opportunities, abilities, and possessions and other things. But just focusing on the abilities part, that's sometimes something we don't associate with stewardship. But really, God gives us talents, God gives us abilities, God gives us ways to work for others. And again, this is not just for us. These are abilities and talents that we can use for the benefit of others, in order to bless others, extend, the blessings that God has given to us to others. So it's really, all-encompassing, financial, material, time, but also abilities and talents and things like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's more like we are stewards rather than that we practice stewardship, right?
Yes.
Like, because I think we so often think of it as like, well, I got to do these certain things to be a good steward, right? Or to practice stewardship. But like what you're saying, Keldie, I think that just is what Scripture teaches. We are stewards. Everything we do, everything we own, everything we touch, everything that is our lives, our time, our minds, all of these things are part of what we give to God, and we rejoice in that privilege of serving with Him and serving Him.
It really is a privilege, right? Because it's, here's the God of the universe, and He wants to give us a little bit of that blessing of what it means to share, what it means to serve. And so it's a real privilege,
So what is the blessing that comes from sharing? We human beings, if we are honest, it's in all of us. We have this tendency to grab, to take more and more and more, to become richer and richer and richer, to think of ourselves, and have us as the center of the attention. So what is the blessing then of sharing, as you said, of that lifestyle of stewardship, if I may say so?
One thing I would start out by saying is just contentment. Being able to be happy, to be content, to be at peace with what I have, even though maybe there's somebody else who has more than I am, but that's okay. I'm happy, I'm content. I know what God has given me, and I'm so blessed of that. It's such a beautiful feeling, a state of mind to have that I think is very important, a huge blessing, like we're talking about. Yeah.
And I think also perspective, again, just this idea of, God has given me these things not just for me, but to share them, to give them, to bless other people, right? So
sense of purpose, right? Yeah.
We are so blessed. And what, is God just blessing us for us? I don't think so. I mean, he says this all through as well. His followers, he blesses them so they can bless other people. Yeah. This is why he calls Abraham. He says, I'm going to bless you so that you can bless the world. Of course, that's also through Jesus, but it's not just that. It's also us partnering with him to bless the world through what God gives us.
Yes, Keldie, you have mentioned contentment. I think that's a beautiful blessing that grows out of that. And it teaches us really that we are enough, that what God has given us is sufficient. There's an additional element that I think that came to my mind as I was listening to both of you, and that is also if we practice that lifestyle of stewardship, I think it gives us a sense of satisfaction that we will never gain, I believe, if we just want to grab things for ourselves, if we just want to hold on to things, if we don't want to share. If you start sharing, there is an opening of the life to blessings that you will never receive if you're not willing to do that. And that gives satisfaction because it's meaningful. It helps.
Yeah.
It reduces suffering. It helps to sustain whatever God has given us in his creation. And the beauty that goes along with that. We don't destroy creation, we try to keep it as good stewards in the best possible shape. And I think that gives satisfaction, the beauty gives satisfaction, and it's just enjoyment that grows out of that. Any additional thoughts that come to your mind as we talk about this subject?
I mean, I think you could almost connect the Sabbath in here.
Yeah.
Right? In the sense of this is the time, but it also is a remembrance of God's blessings to us. And it's also us saying, I'm not going to work this one day, right? Out of every week because I'm giving of myself fully to God that day. And it's a reminder also that I am God's and everything belongs to him. So, and I think that's where maybe these two dovetail, right? So that one of the blessings of Sabbath is that's usually the time where we give, right? Maybe some of our money in tithes and offerings, but it's also vice versa, right? I think giving should make us appreciate and value the Sabbath more, and that interconnection.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thought. We just talked about the Sabbath, actually, and that's an additional thought that you just mentioned, Rahel, that ties very nicely into that theme of stewardship and time. Of course, it's not just the Sabbath time, but that's a special time that we dedicate to God and where we slow down and become more mindful of our lives and what God has given to us and grateful. And yet he has given us not just the Sabbath, he has given us 7 days a week.
Right.
And we need to use every day to be a good steward in God's sense. Yeah. Wonderful. So let's move on a little bit and touch on something. When people talk about stewardship, many people think primarily in terms of financial matters. And even in this fundamental belief, we have tithe and offerings in support of the growth of the church and the ministry of the church and the proclamation of the gospel. Is stewardship really primarily focused on financial matters, or how do we understand that principle in the best possible way?
I don't think it should be focused on financial matters, but I think you're right that it usually is. But that's the way, that's partly, I think, because in the Old Testament, most people didn't give money. They gave, because most of them were subsistence farmers or something like this, and so they gave of their harvest, right? And they would give of their goods and things like that. And so yes, there's some example of giving money, but most of that comes later, right? And so I think we actually have this all through Scripture when it's mentioning tithe, when it's mentioning stewardship. It's like a lot of things, not just money, even though we tend to focus on that. But I'd actually like to go back to Genesis 2 just for a minute, because I think before sin, God instructs us to serve the creation. So actually in Genesis 2:15, it says, the Lord God took humans and put them in the Garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it. And this connects, of course, also back to Genesis 1, where our job is to care for what God has made. And so I actually think the very first thing we should think about with stewardship is, how are we caring for the earth? And of course, this involves money, and I'm not trying to eliminate tithe out of that, but there's a much bigger purpose that we have here, which is reflected all through the Bible as well, in care for animals, care for the land. And unfortunately, we're not very good at that as Christians often today. But I think that's a very clear biblical principle, that stewardship is first of all, our whole responsibility to all of the earth.
That's a really good point. And I like that you mentioned Genesis. Genesis 1 specifically talks about that we are created in the image of God. And, you know, God is the creator. He's the one who made everything. And when you make something, you tend to really care for that. It has a special place in your heart. And, you know, the world, of course, has a special place in God's heart. And he wants us to have that same kind of relationship to the world he created, that care that you're talking about. And that's part of what it means to be created in the image of God. We share that that value for God's creation, for God's world.
That's an interesting thought. Rahel, let me follow up on what you said. I like the idea that stewardship actually starts in the Garden of Eden. It starts at the very beginning, before they even were able to produce anything, before they were even able to earn any money. The principle of stewardship is right there. Now, someone could say, and that would be my question to you, someone could say, yeah, that's fine in the Garden of Eden. That was before sin entered this world, you know. That was when everything was perfect. That makes sense. But now, you know, we live in a world that is filled with sin and evil, and we know that this world will end in destruction. So why should we care for something that is going to burn anyhow? What would you respond to that?
Do you want an hour? No, I'm just kidding. But I think there's plenty to say. But a couple of things I would say, just to try to be brief, is one, that God continues to make that our responsibility after sin. So in fact, over and over, he tells Israel, and then even before Israel, right? He tells, before Israel is there, he's telling the people to care for the earth and to care for the animals. So in the sabbatical year, again, like I mentioned, it's not just for the poor, it's also for the animals. It's not just for the people, it's also for the land. So all of these things that they are doing, the Sabbath, every time the Sabbath is mentioned, almost every time, animals are also part of that rest. And that continues into the New Testament as well, where Jesus reminds the people that the animals should be resting on the Sabbath. And then on the new earth, we're also portrayed as caring for the earth and the animals. And so I think this is like a whole Bible principle of one of our responsibilities as humans is to care for the earth. And of course, our bodies are going to be made new too, but we still are convicted that we should care for our bodies. So I think even if the earth is largely cleansed by fire at the end, that does not eliminate our responsibility to care for it now, because God made it. It's His, and
Exactly.
He's asked us to care for it.
Yes, and if we would not do that, really we would neglect something that God has created and has asked us to inhabit and has asked us to live in as long as it lasts, you know. And so I think we should use every opportunity to make the best out of it, so to speak.
And the animals are creatures that have been given the earth as well. God tells them to be fruitful and multiply. So He didn't just give the earth to us, He also gave it to the animals. So we have a responsibility to share it with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, I'm glad that we made that clear, I hope we did, that stewardship is so much broader and more all-encompassing than just finances and money. And as it says, it's time, opportunities, abilities, possessions, blessings of the earth. It's really a lifestyle. It's who we are. It's how we conduct ourselves in the daily routines and the daily business. But it also involves money and financial aspects. And we briefly mentioned tithe and offerings. Now that might be familiar to us. But can you explain what we mean by tithe? Not everyone might be familiar with that terminology and that concept, that biblical concept, and why and how do Adventists practice that? Can you shed a little light on that for us?
Part of it is we've already mentioned the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath is 1/7 of the week, one day out of 7 that we dedicate to God, that we separate for a different purpose for God. Tithe is very similar in that sense. It's out of all of the money that we have, we separate 1/10 of it to dedicate to God for the furthering of the gospel message and for His work, really. So that's a very simple definition of tithe, but really it's just separating a small part of what we have to help the gospel specifically for that purpose.
Yeah, and I would say, again, this is something that was there from the very beginning. It's almost as soon as we read stories of people in the Bible, we have people paying tithes. So I think the first person we have is Abraham in Genesis 14, and he pays tithes to Melchizedek. And so he pays, he pays 1/10 of what he has there for Melchizedek. So this is often where we get this idea of the 10th. Of course, it's mentioned in several other places as well. But he gives him 1/10 of everything. So this is, again, probably not just money, but possessions and produce and whatever. Interestingly, in Deuteronomy, when we talk about Israel paying tithe and God asking them for tithe, they pay something close to like 25 to 30%, depending on the year. So, this 10 seems to be a minimum.
Yeah.
And sometimes in the Bible, there's much more that they're giving, because they're giving the tithe to pay for the Levites and their service. So that's similar to how we would pay gospel workers today. But they're also paying tithe for the poor, caring for the poor. So that's part of their tithe. And then they also have a part of the tithe that they give to rejoice with God, which I think is just really cool. This idea of taking some of your extra, what you would maybe give for tithe, and like, how can I do a time of rejoicing and celebration together with God? So there was much more that they did with tithe, and it was much more than a 10%. So I think we tend to think of it as this, like, I've got to do this amount or I'm going to be in trouble with God. And I don't think that's the biblical picture. It's this, again, response of joy to what God has given and in the giving back to His work to reach other people.
And just to point out that those things that you just mentioned, Rahel, continue in the New Testament as well. We find the exact same principles, right? 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how, people who work for the gospel have a right to receive financial support for preaching the gospel. So that's similar to the Levites in the Old Testament. And we also find Paul encouraging his churches to set aside some money to help the poor in Jerusalem. So this, helping those who really need more help, financial help and things like that. So all those same principles that we find, these different situations where we're encouraged to separate some money for the gospel, for those who are in need, continue all throughout the Bible.
And also the giving liberally, too, in the New Testament, right? I mean,
Yes.
they gave far beyond the 10%, it seems, at least the early church, right? They're giving a lot. They're giving fields and houses and lands, and right? I mean, they're
True,
just
yeah.
giving abundantly to the work.
So that's interesting. So really, tithe paying is an expression of generosity. It's not something that should be done grudgingly, but with a joyful heart. God says a joyful giver He likes, and so it's an exercise to become more generous in sharing the things that God has given me. Now, how is that practiced in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? I mean, what is this tithe being used for, and to whom do you pay tithe if you pay tithe? How is that handled for all practical purposes?
Well, I actually think it's a really amazing system that we do, because talking with a lot of my friends that are not Adventists, but they're Christians, I mean, so I have a lot of pastor friends and teacher friends, and they're like kind of envious of how we do it, because so often they're having to ask for money in order to make enough salary to pay their bills, right? Because they do tithe kind of in an individual church way. But I actually love our system because we pay tithe, and part of it goes to our local church pastor, part of it goes to the conference, part of it goes to the union, part of it goes to the GC, part of it goes to mission, right? It's a very broad focused thing, and yet each pastor is not paid based on how many members they have, but on their years of service and where they live. And so it's a much more fair and equitable, and it recognizes everyone's work. And I just think that we have a beautiful thing that we do here in the Adventist Church that is that we don't often think about the blessings of it until we talk to someone that's not an Adventist.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Just emphasizing the mission part of it is, it's really significant. Again, I've talked to several people who have friends in the mission field, and it's so hard. They have to fundraise their own money to spend years in the mission field. That's so difficult. And for us, part of our tithe goes towards supporting those missionaries. So they're supported by tithe, by the church, and it's a real blessing to have that kind of system, like you're saying. Yeah.
And I think what you said, Rahel, is so important. You made just a passing remark to that, but really, if you think about it, in the Adventist Church, it doesn't matter whether you pastor a small church or a small district of churches, or if you pastor a church that has several thousand members. A pastor who pastors a large church doesn't earn more money than a pastor who pastors a small church. Now that is significant, I think, and beautiful and important, because if I were to be paid by my local church entirely, then the larger the church, the richer the pastor. The smaller the church, the poorer the pastor. No, there is equity, there is equality. Nobody is, is given preference over another person just because he or she is in a smaller district and has a smaller responsibility. We see everyone should receive the same amount of money that is given by the members. It's given freely. Nobody is forced to do that. It's a voluntary thing that we do out of gratitude because God has initiated that and instituted that. So that, I think, is really a beautiful principle that is active in the Adventist Church when it comes to tithe paying. Now, many people might not have an experience in paying tithe. And they might wonder, how does that work? Money is scarce. We are not that rich, and then I have to pay 10%, which, by the way, is the same no matter how much you earn. It's 10%.
Which also is another fairness aspect.
Exactly. So it's the same for everyone. There is no difference for the poorer or the richer. Everyone is treated equally. And that's another beautiful biblical principle, I think. So, but how does it work? You know, if I have only 90% of the money that I earn, that's significant less than 100%. So do you have anything to share as an encouragement to people who are wondering how should that work out if I should do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real, it can be a real challenge for some people, and it's important for us to recognize that it's not easy for everybody, and yes, some people might come to difficulties through those kind of things, but at the same time, when we're looking at it from a perspective of this is being faithful to God, and to be faithful to God in so many circumstances might mean to come through difficulties. But it's always so much more worth it to be faithful to God, to trust Him, to be able to say, God, I don't know how I'm going to make it through, but I want to be faithful. And, you know, that's really what being a faithful Christian is about, is not having all the answers, not knowing how to get out of every situation, but being able to have that trust in God that He will help you go through things sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I think we've sometimes in the church made it sound like, well, if you pay tithe, you will be blessed beyond measure and you'll have money growing on your trees, you know? And I just think that this is also a false picture sometimes for people, you know, like that can happen. And I know of examples, right, where someone faithfully pays tithe and God just abundantly gives them far beyond what they could imagine, monetarily, prosperity-wise here. But other times, like you mentioned, Keldie, people are sometimes destitute, right? And so I think holding that balance is really important, and recognizing that, like you said, we are needing to be faithful to God no matter what the results are in what happens in our lives.
Yeah, the example of the widow, right? That Jesus sees her giving everything she has. She has 2 small pennies and she gives everything she has to God. It doesn't say that she was immediately rewarded with a bunch more financial support or anything like that. It doesn't say that. What Jesus points out in that situation is her faithfulness and her trust, regardless of what comes next. And I think that's important. Yeah.
And it's really a matter of the attitude. Even with that woman that you mentioned, you know, she had only very little, but she gave that all, you know, and she gave it liberally, and she gave it freely and with dedication. And others, they were much richer, but they would give just a fraction of their richness and wealth. And for her, it was a sacrifice. For them, it was a gesture to be recognized. And that's a huge difference, you know. And if you pay tithe, and if we would pay tithe just with the intention of getting richer, we're doing it for very egoistic reasons. And why should God bless that? And I think that completely misses the picture. But
yeah, and like we talked about earlier, the blessings are not really physical, right? They're a lot of the blessings of stewardship are the spiritual, the emotional, the connection with God, the blessing of others, the sacrifice that connects with Him, the understanding of His heart, like the compassion, all of these things, right? These are not physical, material blessings, though God may give those, right? But I think the most important blessing is the heart blessing. It's the life blessing. It's the attitude blessing, like you were saying, Frank.
Yes, absolutely. And yet I would like to add to what we've just said. I absolutely agree with what you just said. And yet there is a blessing that is connected with tithe paying. You know, even the prophet Malachi, if you read it, says, you know, that we should bring the tithe into God's storage house, you know, and he says, test me in this. You know, it's an invitation to test God and see His faithfulness. And I really have to confess, I mean, it's amazing. 90% with God's blessing is more than 100% without His blessing. And I cannot explain that. I cannot say how that works, but I can testify that if you have the courage to trust God in these matters, He will not disappoint you. It doesn't mean that you will always be rewarded with money and finances. Sometimes He can help you, and the things you own, they run much longer, and they don't need repairs, and there might be other spiritual and physical blessings that grow out of that you can't ever pay with money. And yet, if we pay the tithe, I think there's a special blessing in that faithfulness, that God will not let you get poorer because you're liberal in the giving and generous in the giving.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I have experienced that myself, and I think it applies to offerings as well, right? As we continue to give more than the 10%, like my husband and I have tried to keep increasing, right, what we give, just a small amount every year, like, because it helps us to not get stagnant in our giving. But I guess I just want to remind us that, like, sometimes, like, we have the story of Job in the Bible for a reason, right? Because just because bad things are happening to you does not mean you've been unfaithful to God. So
That's right. Absolutely.
Remind us of that.
Yes,
I think it's important to, yes, God does bless us, but there are times when terrible things happen, and that doesn't mean it's because you haven't given God enough tithe.
That's
I
right.
guess
That's right.
that caveat there.
Yes, yes.
Good. Yeah.
No, that's important. It's important to know. So let me come back to a statement that we have in the fundamental belief that I would like to, we've touched upon that already, but I'd like to explore that even more and see what other aspects might be connected to that. It says at the end that stewardship is a privilege given to us by God for nurture in love, I like that, and for the victory over selfishness and covetousness. So let's unfold that a little bit. How can stewardship, understood in the right comprehensive way, not just limiting it to paying tithe and offerings and the financial aspect, but as a lifestyle, be something that nurtures us in love, and that helps us to overcome selfishness and the envy that often plagues people.
Can I read a passage from Acts 2?
Yes, please.
This is just such a beautiful picture to me of them giving, and it also changing their hearts, right? So this is talking about the early church. This is in Acts 2, starting in verse 44. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. And that to me is just like this all-encompassing picture of stewardship. It's caring for those who were in need. It's giving liberally. It's remembering that it's God's ultimately. And what does it do? It draws them together, right? It makes them in unity. And I think in Acts 4, it talks about them having they're of one heart and soul, right? It's this connection, and it helps to chip away at our selfishness and our desire to keep everything for ourselves. So I just think this, like you were mentioning, this lifestyle of stewardship, being a steward in every aspect of your life, we have examples of people doing that in the Bible.
Yes, and there's great power in the witness of that. If we see that people have that generosity of heart. And I think what is very important when we think about the early church and the passage you just read to us, Rahel, that this was something that was done voluntarily. Yeah. They did that voluntarily. This was not an early communism. It was not a
Correct.
socialist project, that was enforced by the state or by a political power or whatever system that is, This is something that has to grow from the heart in response to God's generosity for us. And then
Correct.
it has a quality that no other human system, whatever it is, can produce for that matter.
Yeah, exactly. It's the key word here is love, right? God gives us so many things out of his great love for us. And to understand that great love that God has for us will eventually lead to us extending that love to others through the use of our possessions, our time, our abilities, and everything. It's for service in love. So it's really, we're only vessels in this picture, right? It never ends with us. God gives us so that we can give to others, and that really is, again, victory over selfishness and covetousness, because it doesn't end with us. It's not for us in and of ourselves. We're given so that we might give. We are blessed so that we might bless.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very important. And I'm also reminded that, in this giving, in this loving giving, it really teaches us that, you mentioned that briefly, 1/7 of the time is dedicated to God, 1/10 of our money is dedicated to Him. Actually, if you look at these figures, 1/7 is more than 1/10. So what God really is interested in is the time He spends with me. This is even more important than the things He would like to have in return for what He has given me in totality. And so that also puts things into perspective. It shows how important the Sabbath is, for one thing, but it also shows that really that relationship, the time quality, is foundational to everything else, and time is mentioned here in the stewardship fundamental belief that we have just read.
Yeah.
Now, any other final thoughts that you might want to add to the discussion here? I see our time is running quickly. That would be your opportunity to share.
I just like this, actually the last sentence there. Stewards rejoice in the blessings that come to others as a result of their faithfulness. So, because I think it's easy to think, well, what is my money doing? Is it really worth giving to the church? Like, what's the church even doing with it, right? And rather than focusing on us and my money and what is my money doing, right? I think stewardship, God encourages us to instead focus on what are the blessings that are resulting, I mean, the Adventist Church does amazing things all around the world, and that would not be possible without our tithe and our offerings. And so thinking of that bigger picture and being so grateful for the blessings that come as a result of our giving, as I think really helpful picture to keep in perspective.
That's a really good point, Rahel. And it's like we can spend our time, we should spend our time researching a little bit. Where is our money going? What are some of the stories that are resulting out of this? And also, not only on a worldwide level, but even within our own communities, what are ways in our community that we can serve, that we can help and support, and how what are the benefits and the blessings that we see coming out of just being involved in the lives of those around us. And it takes some intentionality to do that, but it really helps us be more connected and like you mentioned, be involved in that joy that comes from these blessings.
And it's also an exercise in getting, how should I say, drawing our attention to other people that I would never see if I were just to think about myself. And it's an opportunity that widens our horizon. If you said, what is my money doing? Where is it a help? Where is it a blessing? And all of a sudden I see, okay, there are people there that need help that I would have never recognized and noticed maybe in the first place. And that way it broadens your horizon far beyond the little world of your own life and existence. And that's another beautiful blessing that grows out of stewardship. And yes, you're right, it's something to rejoice to see that the things that I share can be a blessing to other people.
And I would just add one more thing, because I
Sure.
think this has been important for me, and that's that stewardship, tithing, offering giving is often a barometer of my relationship with God. You know, I can use it kind of like the Sabbath. So like when I'm in a good place with God, I am like looking forward to Sabbath, right? And when I'm in a good place with God, I am like, I cannot wait to give as much as possible for Him, to Him. But I think stewardship can help us examine our own hearts. You know, where am I at with God? Is this something I want to do? If not, then Lord, help me to figure out where I need to grow, you know, and
Absolutely.
what things need to change in my life. So it is a joy, not a burden.
I'm so grateful for that perspective that you just mentioned, Rahel. It reminded me of a funny little episode that someone said, you know, especially with tithe paying, you know, some people wonder, you know, should I pay my tithe from my gross income or from my net income, you know, and how much should I pay and how many offerings should I give? And I like your emphasis that it's a spiritual indicator where I am in my relationship with God and how generous I can be in that relationship, you know. And I'd like to say, you know, if you wonder whether you should pay your tithe from the gross or the net, you know, it's a matter of whether you want to have a net blessing or a gross blessing, you know. In a sense, you know, it's not that you fulfill the letter of the law, so to speak. It's not a legalistic exercise. It's something that grows out of the love for the generosity that we have seen in God's dealing with us human beings. Well, thank you so much for joining me on that subject of stewardship. And I'm grateful and thankful that we broadened the theme beyond finances and money to see that it's really a lifestyle matter. It's a matter of how we live our existence in response to God's generosity to us. And it's a matter of responsibility, that we are responsible stewards for whatever He has given us, be that time, be that opportunities. You know, we always have opportunities, unique opportunities that will not come again. And we need to see them and use them to the best of our abilities. And then the talents He has given us, and the possessions, and the wealth, and the blessings of this earth, and all the resources that go along with that. So stewardship is an all-encompassing, beautiful invention of God that reflects His character and enables us to become a little bit more like Him. And so we can be really grateful for that. So thankful. I'm thankful for your contributions, your insights, and your inspirations. And if you would like to learn more what it really means to be a good steward for God in a comprehensive way, if you want to start experimenting what it means to pay tithe and be faithful to God in giving Him the money that belongs to Him, search the Scriptures, read the Scriptures, get to know other Christians who have experience in doing so, where you can learn, and may God richly bless you as you do that. And hopefully we'll see each other again for another session on understanding Adventist beliefs, and I look forward to seeing you again. God bless you. All the best.